Well, good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started tonight. Welcome to our In the Adirondack Library series. My name is Joe Dolan here at the Adirondack Experience Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. We're excited to bring you inside our library here, at least virtually. Our library is the largest, most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and government documents that all relate to the history of the Adirondacks. So throughout this series, we're excited to bring you authors and people that have contributed to our library that all explore Adirondack life, history, and culture. So this series runs from October through May. I hope you'll continue to join us on the first Monday of each month to hear from some fantastic authors. More information about the books and the rest of the series can be found at our website, adkx.org. So our interviewer for tonight and throughout the series is Mitch Tyke. He's the station manager of North Country Public Radio and host of the show North Words. North Words airs the fourth Friday of each month on NCPR from 12 to 1 p.m. There's also weekly podcast episodes, which can be found at northcountrypublicradio.org. All of the shows feature interviews, on-site recordings, and special features all about what makes the North Country such a special and unique place. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Peter Lourie. Peter is the author of many books on adventure, exploration, and the environment, including Locked in Ice, The Polar Bear Scientists, Jack London and the Klondike Gold Rush, and tonight's featured book, River of Mountains, A Canoe Journey Down the Hudson. Elected as a fellow of the Explorers Club in 2019, Pete holds a Bachelor of Arts in Classics from New York University, a Master of Arts in English Literature from the University of Maine, and a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction Writing from Columbia University. He has taught writing at Columbia College, the University of Vermont, and Middlebury College. For over 30 years, he has made a living traveling, writing, and photographing. He visits schools to share his adventures with students and teachers and lives now in Weybridge, Vermont. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Peter. He will provide a brief overview of his book, and then we'll shift into the interview portion with Mitch. Finally, we'll wrap up with some audience questions. So on that note, we welcome your participation throughout the program. You can submit your questions at any time through the Q&A feature by clicking that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Also, be sure to check the chat for important links. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much, Joe. First, I'd like to just thank the museum for allowing me the opportunity to speak tonight. And to you, Mitch Tyke, for doing the interview. And a special thank you to all the people who have helped me along the river and the rivers that I travel. This trip is from a while back, but I'm engaging now to do another trip on the Hudson, which I'll get into later. And I especially want to give a shout out to my pal Ernie LaPrairie, without whom I could never have done this trip on the Hudson River from the source to the sea back in 1990, almost 35 years ago. Ernie lives, as you know, most of you, a stone's throw from the museum. He's a legend in his own time. And without him to help me through the upper river in the Adirondack section, it would never have happened. There's a bit of a story behind how I convinced him to go with me, but maybe we'll get into that later. I'm just going to give you a sketch of the trip and show you some pictures, some old slides that are a little dusty, so that you can get an idea of what it was like to go from the source to the sea back then. And first thing I got to say is why I did this trip. I had been doing adventures in South America. It's a long story, but I was living in Ecuador for a long time and Brazil. And I came back to the United States a little bit later than some. I got married in my mid-30s to a wonderful woman. We bought a house in Beacon, New York, 60 miles from Manhattan on the Hudson River. And we had a little girl named Susanna. Susanna was a feisty little thing. And I was teaching at a high school in Dobbs Ferry, and I I decided I needed to do something. I needed to have an adventure of some sort. So my wife suggested, and she definitely likes it when I have adventures, she suggested that I go ahead and maybe canoe the river outside our house. Now, that was one giant river that not many people traveled on, that I thought. I knew nothing really about it. But it occurred to me that during my summer, I could probably take a canoe and try to travel it. My first idea was to paddle from Manhattan to Lake Tyr, 315 miles, until my wife and other smart people convinced me that the river really goes mostly in the other way. Yeah, of course, the first half, 154 miles, you could take the flood tide all the way to the Troy Dam. But then, the current really does go the other way, especially when you get into the whitewater. It would be kind of crazy. So I did decide to go from the source to the sea, and with Susanna at home, I had a hard time leaving because it was difficult to leave a 1-year-old. But I think having the trip happen right close to home allowed me to be able to get home if I needed to get home. And so anyway, I prepared for the trip by trying to track down somebody to help me through the whitewater of the wonderful Adirondacks. And since I knew nothing about whitewater paddling, when I walked into the Hudson River Rafting Company, and Milda Burns said, "You've got to talk to Ernie LaPrairie." And so I tracked him down at Tupper Lake ski area where he was running the ski shop. And he promptly said, "I'm not going with you." He said, "That's ridiculous. First of all, you can't go in that direction from the sea to the source. And secondly, you don't have any whitewater training." But I kind of talked to him a little more, and he said, "Okay, well, why don't you take a course with John Barry?" John Barry, the canoe builder and whitewater enthusiast, was now in Massachusetts. And so I went over there. He'd left the Adirondacks, and I took a course with him. I actually got into one of his light boats called the Fog, and I promptly tipped over. And I got back in and tried to, work my way up to a little waterfall. And John reported back to Ernie that, yes, indeed, Peter might work out. So Ernie decided to go with me. And I'll get into that a little bit when I show you the pictures. But as far as I know, at that time, I was the only one probably dumb enough to actually try to go from the very beginning with one canoe all the way from source to sea. I know that a number of people, and maybe somebody listening today, have done some great educational trips and are making source to sea trips in different fashions. But this was 1990, and the day before I left, my daughter said the greatest word in the English language. She looked up at me and she said, "Dada." And that was very hard to leave the house because she had said ball and she had said mama, but that day she said Dada. And now I had to leave for 2.5 weeks to paddle to my house in Beacon and then 3 days to Manhattan. And that was hard to do, because I would be going for about 1/24 of her life, and she didn't speak any English at the time, so she had no idea where I was going, and that was a little bit difficult. So let me show you some pictures, and then we can open up to questions, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the trip. This was the book that came out 5 years after the trip. I had written a children's book that came out after a few years. This was the adult book with Syracuse University Press, one of the great presses, and it's been in print for 30 years. So now there's a 30-year edition, and so that's the book. Here's the girl Susanna. She's a little younger here, but you can see by those eyes that that was a good reason to need a little rest from home life and get out and have an adventure. And I chose this giant river, this wonderful river, because it went past my house. I didn't know a lot about it at the time. As you know, the river drops from Lake Tyr all the way to the Troy Dam. It's about a 4,000 plus drop, 4,000 foot. But from Troy Dam all the way to Manhattan, 154 miles, the drop is about 1 foot in elevation, 5 feet with the tide. So basically 4,000 feet, 1 or 5 feet. And this was a river that made up of many, many fascinating parts. In order to make this trip, I hired Ernie LaPrairie, and he was wonderful enough to go with me, a real expert. There are no charts or maps of the river, so I got a road map, and I put down each one of these dots as a night I spent along the river. In the Adirondacks, there were 7 nights, and then LaPrairie left me at Lake Luzerne, and I was alone through the feeder canal, the dam section, feeder canal, and then on the Champlain Canal, 40 miles to Troy, and then on the tides all the way to my house, and then Manhattan. The Adirondacks, I had been going to since I was a kid, and I just loved the idea of sort of ending my trip here, and that's why I wanted to go in that direction. But now I started the trip in the Adirondacks on Mount Marcy at Lake Tyr. Many of you know, obviously, Lake Tyr of the Clouds looks like a teardrop. Colvin, the geographer, called it Lake Tyr of the Clouds. This is now filling in through a natural process called eutrophication, and someday it won't be the highest pond source anymore if it all fills in. Maybe it'll be Lake Avalanche or something nearby. And LaPrairie and I planned the trip. He's a great outfitter, and he helped me get all kinds of gear that I needed. And one of the most important things was the Winona Odyssey canoe, retired canoe that we took. It's both a good tripping boat, and it's fast, and it works in whitewater, but it's Kevlar, and it can take some pretty big beating in the big rocks. LaPrairie put an extra seat in the center so that I could be alone after he left me. LaPrairie being a strong guy, we left Upper Works parking lot, and he put the Odyssey on top of his head, and off we went. 9 miles, and took about 9 hours. LaPrairie carried the canoe all the way up. And I kept saying, hey, Ern, what about, letting me take it? He says, well, if you can, if you want. But I could tell that he wanted to be the first ever to take a canoe all the way up, because he had mentioned it to some friends, and I think they thought it was ridiculous, and he was taking the challenge, and I let him do it. I had a 60-pound pack, and my legs were killing me. We went up and up and up and got to where the wind was so kind of wild that trying to keep that canoe on your head and walking on that trail is really, really difficult. Got to the lake, and it was a very rainy kind of a day. You can't see the mountain up in the clouds. So we went back to a lean-to and camped. When we got back to the lake the next day, the first day of paddling, it was a perfect day. It was just perfect. The mountain came out, and we got in the canoe. Jim Swedberg, wonderful photographer and kayaker and whitewater enthusiast from Long Lake, came up and took pictures. Now, Jim also took pictures in the whitewater section. So we hired him for 3 days, the publisher did, to take pictures of me and Ernie through the whitewater section. But you go across that lake in about 3-4 minutes now in a racing canoe, and we get to Feldspar Brook, and we can only get out of the lake this far. So now we're headed to Manhattan, but we can only leave this far in the boat, and so we have to carry it back down because it's too steep and rocky. So I started carrying it down. I had a bad knee from some hockey injuries as a kid, so my pal helped me carry it together down the steep slopes of Marcy. And it was a perfect day. It was a beautiful, beautiful day to begin the trip to New York City. We got to a section of river where we could throw the canoe into the whitewater. Now notice that this is not the same Winona Odyssey. Mike Chickanowski of Winona actually lent us this canoe with extra Kevlar on the bottom and aluminum gunnels. The other one that you'll see has wood gunnels. That's one I took all the way down to Manhattan. But for the whitewater section, we used the borrowed canoe from Chickanowski, who is the president or the director of Winona. In the whitewater section, many of you who paddled through here, sometimes in a long boat, you can't paddle. So we had to make decisions. Thank God La Prairie knows the river so well, where we had to line the canoe through the whitewater, especially around the Tahouse Club Bridge and some of the whitewater later on, but especially that first section from Upper Works down to Newcomb. We had the whitewater bag in there for safety. We had a couple of Adirondack guides, young guys, friends of Ernie's, Jamie Frazier, who brought stuff in on the North Woods Club Trail and to Blue Ledges. So we didn't take a lot of stuff with us. We knew we were going to tip over. We had bailers to get the water out and wetsuits to keep us warm. The water was cold. It was early June. That section before, you get to Newcomb and then after Newcomb, it's just stunningly beautiful. Before the whitewater begins, we even found a TV. There's some, cleanup of the river that still needs to be done, I guess. But basically, because of the rafting operations, things have gotten very, very clean and nice. We did come across a cross. I think it was near the Polaris Club. I'm not sure. A sign that a logger had lost his life here during the logging days. One of the difficulties, of course, was the log jams. Very dangerous to go out with your pike poles and peavies and try to unjam these logs. Jack Donahue, we met his daughters, Milda and Helen, and Jack was the great Finch Prine river driving boss who was able to drive logs all the way from North River area where he was through letting out certain dams along tributaries, holding dams, and then work those logs all the way down 100 miles to Big Bay and Big Boom near Glens Falls. Jack Donahue's grandson and I just were talking a couple of days ago. I know him from Cold Spring, and he took a picture of the Finch Prine 1929 map that shows you every one of these little marks is a holding dam that Jack was able to let out water and work the logs all the way down to Thurman and then all the way down to Big Bay in one season, which was really remarkable. The log drives here down in Big Bay and Big Boom, they were separated into chutes that then went to certain sawmills. They were marked and tagged. So we got ready for the big whitewater. We had crash helmets on, and Jim Swedberg set up on a rock and took pictures, which he does so well, and got some pictures of us learning how to paddle. For me, I had been in the whitewater with Ernie once in Perry Ellers in North River, and we had tipped over, and now we were about to tip over again. But it was fun to work with him because I think we made a good team. And we got all the way to Blue Ledges and had a great night, and then some more difficult rapids coming out of Blue Ledges. La Prairie knows every rock and every sort of rapid by the back of his hand. I mean, he really was fantastic. And being in the bow, he was able to make decisions, and I was able to follow with prying or sweeping, and he would draw or cross draw on the bow, and we became a good team. Coming out of Blue Ledges, this mile-long rapid was a difficult one. I did a little bit of lining, and then we scouted it and got in the boat, and these are just shots. There's no shot of us actually tipping over, but we hit a rock and we couldn't get off it. Actually made a mistake. I leaned upriver. The next rock we hit was just volume of water and just, tipped us over. So we tipped over a couple of times, and we became a good team. And La Prairie was such an excellent guide. I just want you to look at this picture and look how calm this riverman is. And look at this dude over here. I was a little nervous, but you know what? It was fun, and we got through it. La Prairie took me all the way down past the Glen, past Thurman Bridge, all the way to Lake Luzerne, to the falls. And that's where he decided he didn't really want to go any farther outside of the blue line. And so I was alone. So his wife, Kim, picked him up and took him back. And later on, we went to other trips, Mississippi and the Yukon River. But now I was alone. He had a 1-year-old at home too, so he needed to get home to his job and to his 1-year-old and his family. Now I was headed for Manhattan. Came to the big dams at Corinth and Spire Falls and Sherman Island. And in those days, I didn't have a lot of permission to get around them, so I had to kind of run on this spillway. I came down here and ran with my canoe, and I just couldn't find anybody to get permission from. I did have a wonderful journalist at the Post-Star help me get around the Corinth dams, the IP dams. But I got to Glens Falls feeder dam, and I ran into a wonderful family, and they taught me a lot about the river, and I decided to take the feeder canal. The fascinating thing about this section of the river, as it goes east here out of the Blue Ledges, and then it goes east here from feeder dam on a small canal that feeds the Champlain Canal. And so to avoid the big dams on the main river where Finch Prine, and there's a lot of dams here, you hop in this little tiny canal and you follow it 7 miles where it goes all the way over to the Champlain Canal, and it feeds the Champlain Canal the water it needs between lock 8 and 9, which are the highest locks, to be able to run the lock, the canal all the way down to Fort Edward, which is lock 7, where it rejoins the Hudson, or all the way up to lock 12 at Whitehall. Without that feeder feeding the water into the Champlain, there would be no way to make the Champlain work. And that feeder was built in the late 20s, early 30s, and different iterations, and it's still running today. So I went with a Post-Star journalist and a guy, Dave Bishop, wonderful guy that I met there at Feeder Dam, and we paddled past Finch Prine and everything on the feeder canal. Some of the old combines, the old locks are still there. This is one of the only canals that still, active canal that's been in operation since the 1830s. Because as you know, the Erie Canal and the Champlain, but mostly the Erie, had many iterations. Once they started using the Mohawk River and they had tugboats, they didn't draw the boats by horses. They increased the size of the boats. But here, these are the locks that came down one particular steep section, and the little canal boats would go through these locks. And the feeder canal still is operating all the way over to Champlain. And then I went down to Fort Edward on the Champlain, that one more lock, and then I got on the Hudson and went for 40 miles through Schuylerville and Stillwater, and Mechanicville, all the way down to Troy. So that 40 miles is sort of the lock section of the Champlain Canal. Ran into boats like that, was able to lock through all the locks. One of the wonderful things was I learned from the lock tenders in those days. Even they were generations of lock tenders. They would pass the jobs on, not unlike miners do in some mining areas. That's kind of no longer the case. But these locks, you'd paddle in these doors to avoid the dam over here. And the lock tender would say, "Are you ready?" And the doors would close, and I would brace in the center of the lock, and 1 million gallons were displaced for my canoe. Today, you have to hold a rope for safety's sake, and I think it's a little harder because it's kind of slimy. Lock tender looking down. It's a beautiful section that locked the Champlain Canal. Beautiful, beautiful section of river, and so calm and pastoral. And then I was able to camp on the locks, and still can. The lock tenders see a lot of long people who are taking long trips around the country, passing through these locks. Met wonderful lock tenders along the way, and went through those 7 locks down to lock 1. Past Mechanicville, and the industry really started up. There were quite a few dead fish around where the Erie Canal comes in at Lansingburg, and I saw these kids who said they didn't swim in the river. I'd seen ropes all the way up and down the river where people swam, not in this particular area where the 2 canals meet, just north of the Troy US Lock 1. And those kids were, interestingly enough, I did school programs for 28 years, and these kids were in one of my classes, and they said, "We thought you were crazy." But that was kind of fun. That was in Half Moon or Waterford. There's US Lock 1. It's a huge lock. And I paddle through this. And once you go through this lock, you are actually in the tides. You're in the biggest inland estuary in the world, and it runs all the way from Manhattan to this dam and this lock at Troy, 154 miles. And now I have to take the ebb tide. Of course, Henry Hudson in 1609 got about that far or just a little bit south in Albany in the half moon and turned around because he realized it wasn't going to the far east. Albany, I camped in that park and paddled on. The boats get big, and here the dangers are quite different. Taking the ebb tides, so every 6 hours I can take a pretty good current. But these guys have some big waves at both the beginning, back of the tug, and the barges, and you have to turn and brace so you don't tip over. River gets big, and Kingston area, I came to these lighthouses in Athens and Kingston, and saw and talked to and met many wonderful fishermen, fishing contests, and learned some of the history of the ice industry along the Hudson, where they would cut the ice and put them into ice houses and then ice boxes, back in the day before they had refrigerators. And of course, the brick industry, as I got further and further south, Newburgh, Haverstraw, the many brick industries along the way. You can even stay in this one at Kingston. I think it's a bed and breakfast. It was then. I think it might be still. Got to Poughkeepsie now, and I've been away for about 2.5 weeks, and I'm anxious to get home. So I paddle early in the morning to my house in Beacon, and I actually told my wife I wasn't coming. I said I was going to come the next day. I paddled all morning long. I got there. I left my boat at the dock at the Beacon Pete Seeger's Sloop Club dock in Beacon, across from Newburgh, and I grabbed my paddles and I went up to my house and surprised my family. As I tell the kids, some of you may have heard me tell the story about coming home to Susanna, and she was in a playpen and she was freaking out when she saw me, and she made me suffer a good deal before I could pick her up in the playpen. And then she said the word dada and everything was fine. Spent the night at home and had to get back on the river. When I got back on the river, I came to this incredible old castle that was built by Bannerman to house ammunition, guns, and military supplies at the top of the Highlands, the Hudson Highlands. And now it's sort of being fixed up, but it was kind of going to rack and ruin, kind of a spooky thing. Paddle underneath the rampart and into the Hudson Highlands, past Storm King Mountain and Breakneck over here. And when I got down to Bear Mountain Bridge, I heard the story of Captain Kidd, the pirate. And I heard that Captain Kidd had sailed up this river, and I don't know if it's true. In 1699, he had a crew from Hudson, New York, some of them, and he had a storm, and the ship sank here, and he had a treasure on board, and he carried up this mountain, and he supposedly buried it underneath a big tree, and he cut the head of his dog off and buried his dead dog's body on top of the treasure, so it would curse the treasure, and treasure hunter would be haunted by the ghost of the dog. I don't know if it's true, but I do know that it became a story that I wrote for kids, and I used that story for a novel I wrote for kids. Paddled on past the great nuclear power plant, and of course John Cronin had sponsored my trip a little bit to do a little PR. One of the original river keepers, John helped me a lot on the lower river. I got to meet fishermen. Now, these are the DeGroat family from Haverstraw, Stony Point area, and they too come from a family that has been fishing for generations. And I think that's also stopped, but I talked to them before they went out on their flat bottom fishing boats and got to the Tappan Zee Bay Bridge. Went to my last night at the Palisades here in this little marina. I spent the night, and then on the 21st day, I went underneath the Bear Mountain Bridge and over to Manhattan. And it was like coming to a haunted, sort of an abandoned city. All these old things sort of falling apart. I went up to the Intrepid Museum now, touched it and paddled on. Can't do that after 9/11. and I saw the seagulls, and I knew I'd reached the end of my trip. Got all the way down to the World Trade Center and paddled past it. Now I had to take this one out of my slideshow for kids after 9/11. Got to the fireboat, and luckily my wife, Melissa, here, and my stepfather helped me pull the boat up. It was a 5-foot drop at low tide, and I was interviewed by the media, and they said, what was it like to go down this incredible river in 3 weeks? You know, from this mountain and this beautiful lake, what was it like to go into the whitewater? I said it was one of the best trips I've ever taken, because when you're with a buddy, there's nothing like it. And then when, you know, he leaves you and you get to go all the way to Manhattan and to the people you love, nothing like it. Best trip I ever made in my life, and probably changed my life for the better. I wrote a kid's book. I wrote a novel kid's book, and I wrote a book that it now has a new edition. And anyway, I thought I'd just make it that fast so that we could open it to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And we already have questions starting to come in, but I will suggest that we'll get to them quickly. But if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will answer them over the course of the next half hour or so. You know, let me start with a big picture kind of question for you, if I could. And that is, you explained why this adventure took place on the Hudson River, partly or largely because it was right in front of your house. But why adventure at all? Why was doing something like this part of who you are? When did you first get the adventurer's bug?
You know, I had gone to Camp Temagami when I was a kid. I grew up in Burlington, Ontario for a long time, and we went up to Camp Temagami, and we take long trips, like Keewaydin. The Keewaydin Temagami people were up there. They were our rivals, but I just enjoyed being out in streams that were completely untouched, it seemed, and long trips. I enjoyed that a lot. When I got older, I started, you know, I studied literature, and I fell in love with nonfiction, like Peter Matheson, Paul Theroux, some books about travels where you mix, in nonfiction, you mix history, people, and place, and then you have an adventure and write about it. And it just seemed that the Hudson was the perfect vehicle for me to mix these interesting aspects, and have a personal journey at the same time. So in some ways, it launched me into my career as a writer. You know, it's interesting because I was 38 when I made the trip, but I was still a young dad, you know, and just married. So it was the beginning of my career.
Does it amaze you in some ways that you are still telling the tale of this trip 35 years on?
That's a really good question, because, you know, what happened was the publisher of the children's book, Highlights for Children, they wrote a note to all the principals and PTAs up and down the Hudson River and said, Pete would love to come talk to you about his adventure. Well, you know, I didn't know anything about that. And I luckily, there was a guy named Mike Chandler who was a painter, and he and I put together a little slideshow, and that was the beginning of doing a talks to elementary kids. I saw how excited they got when you showed them that they could also have an adventure, that they could travel and then travel overseas and meet people that they never thought that they would ever meet, and go to places they never thought they could. And I wove in the story of my daughter in a much more graphic way than I told today, and my family, because that sort of, they related to that. So it launched me into this love of exciting and inspiring kids to have their own adventures, to love the world and people, other people, and not just themselves, and to get out there. Then I went on subsequently and taught a number of courses at Middlebury College. And one of the main things that I wanted to convey was that once you latch on to a mentor and have an adventure, whether it's dog sledding or whatever, you know, you connect with somebody, and those connections sometimes have lasted those students a lifetime. So I think it's a kind of there's something humane about why I did it, I think, you know, teaching.
You mentioned your daughter, but I don't think you touched on the fact that she herself leads adventures now. Is that correct?
Yeah, she's a lot more daring and than I am. She's a ice and alpine and rock climber in Ouray, Colorado. And you know, I went out there and tried to do a little climbing on ice, and you know, I got up 20 feet, and I said, nah, I don't know. I went down, and then she belayed me down. Then I come down, I go back up 20 feet, and I go, I don't know. Yeah, I can't do that kind of stuff. So she got a kind of a message, I think, that I was Mr. Adventure. I'm kind of scared most of the time, you know.
The thing that really struck me, especially you and I have talked about this book in the past, and I had the great good fortune to read it, but seeing your presentation now and seeing these photographs in full color was really something. But it also dawned on me that this adventure was done in one of the last eras before social media. And it occurs to me that had you been doing this at a time where you could have been, you know, showing the world as you went, it might have been a completely different trip.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad it isn't that way, you know. I know that this British guy just swam the river, and there was a lot of PR involved, and you know, and sort of at the moment sort of stuff. I'm glad I was able to do it in the old-fashioned way. Some of my students in Middlebury are encouraging me to try to do it again, if I do it again, which I'm thinking of doing, and doing it like I did before with just a tape recorder and you know, a still camera, and sort of slow down a little bit and not do the you know, the PR thing.
We already have questions that are lining up, so let me jump to a couple, and again remind people that if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to take them. Anthony would like to know, what did you observe or learn while paddling along the Hudson River about the changes that were occurring or that are occurring on and along the river caused by either industry or by climate change?
You know, that's a really good question, and I'm actually setting out to answer that question now, because I saw it a certain way. It was like a shot, a sort of still shot in time, and things were changing there. The PCB stuff was going on, but it's still going on. And so I'm very curious 35 years later, when I make my trip next year, as a bookend for my life, you know, my whole life is in between these two trips. Well, how has it changed? And I've been driving up and down the river, meeting some of the same people and new people, and seeing incredible changes. For instance, the feeder canal in the Glens Falls, Hudson Falls area has been fixed up. It's a towpath. It's beautiful walking, biking. Things have gotten better. Along the lower river, there's parks and everything. So yes, some of the pollution is still there. It's definitely getting cleaner. I'm not sure I would swim in it like that guy did, but I will tell you that there's some big changes, and I want to explore what those are. So your question, you need to ask me that question after I take my next trip, because I want to find out exactly how has it changed since then. I think there are some good changes and some things that are still being fought over, like the PCBs. I don't think the Clearwater has gotten very far. Maybe they have, but I see in the newsletter a lot of some of the same issues from 35 years ago.
Well, and so Carolyn had asked the question, are you motivated to do this trip again so that you can make comparisons with your earlier trip? And that seems like one of the key reasons that you'd like to do this trip again.
Yeah, I think I'd love to compare. I was actually walking in the mountains of Tucson, and I was trying to come up with a new project. And I thought, oh, I got to walk the Arizona Trail or something and learn all about the history and the people along the Arizona Trail. This sort of man-made trail, a series of trails that have been put together from Utah all the way to the border with Mexico. But I thought, and then I suddenly thought, why don't I re-travel the Hudson? Why don't I go back to the river that started it all and find out how things have changed? Not only that, how have I changed? How has the world changed? What is climate change really doing with the river? This is why these are the greatest questions that I might be able to attempt to answer. Not to mention the memoir aspect of it, where you're on a river again. That you were on before, and how does memory, what's happening with a life? How does a life change? So I am really excited about doing it again.
Do you feel, and maybe it's hard to put yourself in that place that you were 35 years ago. Did you feel more like an explorer or an anthropologist when you did this?
Yeah, I would say it was a combination of things. When I was in the Adirondacks, you feel like an explorer. Um, when you start to meet people and you learn about the locks, and you see the pride that the lock tenders take. Like, I've been interviewing a wonderful guy, Ed Ferguson, in a lock 8 on the Champlain, and the pride that even then and still that the lock tenders take in this engineering that is from the early 19th century, some of these old fuse boxes and everything, unbelievable. So that you learn it's kind of sociological on the one hand, and it's also anthropological or sociological on the other hands. But it's really about seeing these different sort of industries along the way. How have they changed? What's going on now? I think education is sort of interesting. What's going on at Norrie Point? Some of these, and I understand there's maybe you're out there working from Saranac with high school students, and have produced a movie traveling the river and then testing the water along the way. I find that at the Yonkers Yacht Club, Yonkers Paddling Club, same thing. People are going out, and citizen scientists, they're testing the water along the way. So that's kind of new, that part. And I think that's wonderful. Yeah.
You talk about some of the people that you met along the way, and those are some of the most fascinating parts of this book. We're having this conversation, obviously, the night before election day. At the end, one hopes of one of the longest and most contentious campaign seasons in memory. Is there something you think we might take from your experiences meeting people from all walks of life as this trip unfolded that we might use to move forward,
Yeah.
beyond election day?
You know, I can tell you from my experience retraveling the river and meeting people at the Garnet Mine and the Bartons, and meeting people at the Locks and people at the Kingston Maritime Museum, and Joan Burke and people in Newcomb. I can tell you that it is so wonderful again, 35 years later, to be delving into the subjects and the interests of people along the way without any political discussions, because there's such humanity of the connections that you can make with people. And I think that's given me great hope. This just reconnecting with people from all different kinds of situations, and it's really made me, thank God. I feel like vigor. I feel like I'm relit. I've been revived.
Are you concerned that it'll be harder to keep politics out of your conversations the next time you do this?
You know what? I've interviewed people all through the Arctic. Scientists, Inupiat, Eskimos, in the Amazon, all kinds of tribes. I listen, but I don't engage in a political discussion. I always listen, and it's amazing how the political stuff goes away so fast. It's not that deep. It's really very shallow. There's so much that a person brings to swimming in a river as a kid. There's a wonderful guy named Frank Anderson I just met. I can't wait to go. He grew up around the dams, and he talks about what it was like to swim there when he was a kid. I can't wait to learn more about that. That's what I'm interested in.
Anthony had a follow-up to his earlier question. He says, "Thank you for doing this trip and writing about it. You're one of only a few individuals who feel it's important to present this quest for posterity to all those who will never get an actual chance to experience a trip like this. Kudos to you, and keep on paddling. There are still many adventures to discover." And he says, "Thank you." Also, Elaine, in a similar vein, writes, "No questions, just a true thanks for an incredible adventure that you have shared."
Thank you. Thank you very much. I look at them, I often tell kids, they're discovering cities, Mayan cities still. Cities are being discovered like this week. And I know a guy from the University of Texas at Austin. I did a book about him and the Palenque and the Maya, and he discovered a city himself.
Wow.
Studied satellite photographs. So that all of these things are still there. And that's why I get excited, trying to introduce this stuff to kids. This is the exploration gene, the bug, the thing you get when it's there. You can still do it.
Tammy writes, has anyone else gone from Lake Tier all the way to New York City at this point? Also, those areas that you got lucky to get around, what do you have to do to make sure you don't get hung up?
That's a good question. Right now, I got a call into a number of people to get around the IP dams. Because I don't want to get in trouble with the companies, and it's a little hard when a writer shows up. Some of these companies don't really like writers. They think you're going to do an expose or something. I'm not, but especially if you're doing a children's book, it's a little better. But still, I'm still trying to get help to get around things. What was the first part of that question?
The first part of the question was, has anybody else done this trip since you did it?
Yeah. Since, yes, definitely. Before, as I say in the beginning of the book, I got the idea partly by talking to Rob Frenette in Tupper Lake, who told me about a guy named Brian Coons, who ran the outdoor program at Dartmouth, who for BU for 3 years had run trips by hiking up to the source, coming down in some inner tubes through the Whitewater, getting in kayaks and canoes and going all the way to Manhattan. And it was a youth survival kind of thing. He did it in the 70s. And I've been in touch with Brian again. We just had lunch a few days ago. Wonderful. So people have been doing different iterations of this for a while. Whether or not they would take a canoe, like one canoe, I guess the idea was I didn't really want to do it in a lot of different boats. I wanted one canoe. We did have that the Winona extra that Mike Chickanowski had given us for the Whitewater section, which was sturdier, just for that Whitewater section. At the Glen, I switched back to my canoe and I went all the way to Manhattan. So I don't think a lot of people have done one canoe. There was a guy I talked to afterwards who had a Pete Hornbeck, and he was going to do sections or maybe the whole way. And I think he might have done it. A guy named Mike, I think. I just don't remember what happened with that.
Pardon me for asking what might be an obvious question, but the first time you did this, you were a younger man.
Yeah.
Are you prepared for the reality of doing this with 35 more years of life behind you?
Yeah, well, that's the story, isn't it? That's part of the story. The story, I don't have to do, I never did this originally to be the first guy to do it. I did it, to get out of the house. Melissa loves it when I go away. She likes it when I take some trips. We're very independent, and that's probably why we've been married for 35 years, 36 years. And I think I want to do it again. I'll see if I can do it. If I need a motor, I'll get a little motor. It really isn't about, it's not a physical feat. I don't want to pretend that I am some macho guy. I mean, I got a torn rotator cuff. I mean, and if Ernie and I actually hike back up to Lake Tier, if I can get him to go, I mean, he's got all of the hard life he's had. He's got hip issues. I got this kind of issue, ankle issues. It's not about that. We'll just see how it goes. And if it works, it works. We're not going to do the Whitewater section. My idea now is Rob Hart runs the train, what do you call those the little bike rail?
Yes, the rail bikes. Yeah.
Out of North Creek, and Rob happens to be an actor friend of my wife's, and so Rob is going to help me put the canoe on the back, and Ernie and I are going to pedal our way up the Hudson, and then the Boreas back over to Blue Ridge, and then up to Tahoe. So that section, is going to be kind of fun. Like a couple of days of eating some nice cheese dip, with crackers. So it's not about like a feat of doing it in a canoe. I don't need to do that. I'm not some young guy. And so it's an elderly gent sort of thing. And if it's blowing too hard, or if the north wind is too strong, and because the trouble with going north on the tide is that north wind is against you a lot, and the currents take a couple hours to turn around, and they build up much, I think, a little more going ebb tide. So now I gotta, I'll be limited, so I'll have to play it by ear. But that's part of the story. Getting older is part of the story. Getting home is also the story. I was paddling home last time, 60 miles from the sea. Now I'm paddling home 60 miles from the source, because Middlebury is 60 miles exactly from the source. So the idea is just to kind of rediscover and explore a place I've been before, I think.
When you think about the trip and the children's book that came after it, and then the grown-ups book that came after it, how did those experiences shape everything you did in your writing and adventure career afterwards?
I guess learning on the Hudson the very essence of what makes good nonfiction, which is a narrative weaving in history, information, environmental stuff, people, especially people, and place, the beauty of a place. The love and passion the seed for my interest in all the other trips came from this Hudson trip. I mean, I'd been in the Amazon, and I had fallen in love with an Incan treasure story, and I wrote a book still in a print with University of Nebraska called Sweat of the Sun, Tears of the Moon, about an Incan treasure. So I was interested in that kind of thing. But the Hudson made it real for me, and I was able to go on to many other subjects. And yes, many of them are children's books, but that was fun. And it was part of my job as a school presenter to actually publish books too. And then I could explore many, many subjects. I didn't go into in the same amount of depth. You just can't, yeah.
I want to get to a couple more questions or comments submitted in the Q&A. Sylvia writes to say thanks for sharing your adventure with an armchair adventurer. And Tammy followed her question about about whether people had done this before. She writes, amazing. Having been up to Lake Tyr, it never would seem that it could lead you to New York City. And I have to say that my wife and I are relatively recent transplants to the North Country. I lived here for 2 years in the 90s, but we drove to an event from our home in Potsdam recently to Saratoga Springs, and she had not been past some of those reaches of the Hudson River in the North Creek and North River areas, and she said the same thing. It was amazing to her that this is the same river that flows into Manhattan.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about the river is the variety and of the pieces of the river. So you've got the upper river, you've got the middle upper river, you got the lower upper river. Then you got the dams and the locks, and then you got the industry, and then you got the sea and the tides. It's just like, are you kidding me? I mean, how many rivers do you have here? You got a gazillion rivers in one river. And I think that holds true with the people. And so by traveling the whole thing, I mean, Benson Lossing, as the artist, did it in the 1800s and wrote about it. And, you tie things together when you travel the whole distance. And a 315-mile trip is not that long. It's not like traveling from Alaska to South America or to Tierra del Fuego. So in some ways, it's just a perfect place to see this variety. And I don't think many rivers have this kind of the stitching together of mini histories and mini sections that are so different.
Right. I mean, there's the Mississippi River when it leaves Lake Itasca is small and rural, but fairly quickly, once you get to the Twin Cities, it's a huge river from that point on.
Right. Ernie and I did that. We went up to Lake Itasca and paddled that section. And that is also very beautiful. Like many rivers, they begin in sort of semi or wilderness. But it becomes this huge, and the Missouri the same. I went up the Missouri with William Leastheat Moon when he wrote River Horse, and you know, it was a pretty much very standard kind of river. You had to go around the dams, the bends, and the sandbars are incredible. It wasn't until we got to Three Forks that it suddenly became kind of a wilderness, semi-wilderness river. But that was way up there, and you know, a couple of thousand miles.
We have a wonderful comment from Martha, who writes, I'm a retired teacher from the Hudson Valley. I have a vivid memory of walking my class down the hall as Peter entered the building for a presentation. He had his boat and gear, and they were riveted to his words. While they were learning about the first explorers that came to the Americas in class, they learned that great adventures and journeys were still happening and that they could do the same. Thanks for the memory. And I got goosebumps reading that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was one of the great blessings of my life that I was able to do school programs. And, you know, I must have talked to a million kids, and I just went out and did a third grade in New City. And it was fun again, you know. It's harder as you get older, but I just loved turning kids on to this stuff. And it's been a blessing. Who would have guessed that I could make a living going into schools and, you know, selling books and turning kids on to adventure, but also to other cultures and to exploration and to a kind of humility, really. And I think that's been just a blessing. Thank you very much.
Do you still have the canoe that made this trip?
You know, it's so funny. For all of you who've seen that canoe, I will say that canoe bit the bullet. So what happened was, it was Ernie's tripping boat, and I had a Grumman. I had like a 14-foot Grumman, and he said, "You take a Grumman through the whitewater, you're going to stick to the rock and you'll tip over. It's very dangerous. So you need this boat." But he sold it to me for, I don't know, $1,000, and I gave him the Grumman, and it's a $2,500 or $3,000 boat, but he had already been using it for tripping. But it did not have the proper amount of protection in it for the sun, for the you know, the rays,
UV rays, yeah.
And so every time I strapped it onto the car to take into your schools, it would buckle, and it buckled and buckled until it just broke. And then one day I was doing a school program, and the line on the back, I didn't see it, and I drove over it, and the whole boat just broke like and I had to take it to the dump, and so that's gone. I do have a Winona Jensen, which is also a retired boat, 17-foot. That's the one I'm going to take. Chickanowski at Winona gave that to me at cost when Ernie and I went out there and paddled part of the Mississippi, went to Winona and did some PR shots for them in the river, and I bought that boat at cost, and that's the one I'm going to take. I was going to take a kayak, but I can't get in and out of a kayak very easily anymore. It's really hard. You know, you get older, you got to have a canoe.
Anthony sent one more follow-up. He writes, Peter's book falls in the category of human exploration of our environment and history. Two other books that fall in this category are On Freedom Road, Bicycle Explorations and Reckonings on the Underground Railroad, and Freedom, which also explores railroad lines. And so that reminds me that I was going to ask you whether there are other books by other adventurers that you would recommend, that as someone who writes in this genre, you were especially fond of.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You know, when I teach this, you know, some of the classics. I teach Peter Matheson's Snow Leopard. I know there are a lot of men, but I teach John McPhee. You know, I teach Greta Ehrlich's books, you know, Solace of Open Spaces. I mean, there's so many. I have a list actually of these kinds of books that I put together as a bibliography that I had I put on a website for my class. And if anybody be interested, I could, you know, share that because I do have a list of wonderful.
Oh, fantastic. John McPhee, in particular, you mentioned his work was really influential. I took an essay writing class in college that was really revelatory to me, and we had to read as preparation John McPhee's Oranges, which I thought was just an amazing way of drilling down and getting at a topic that you didn't know you'd be interested in until you read it.
Yeah, and the way he weaves in, I mean, just the craft, he slaves as a writer to get that writing to seem so natural. But the way he weaves the information and the people he meets, the experts, it's just stunning. It's stunning. And so
What
he wrote a book on writing, and we often studied that one in the class too.
what is the hardest part of the writing process for you?
You know, for me, I did a book on polar bear scientists. I did a series for Houghton Mifflin on scientists in the field. I did manatee and polar bear and whaling with Craig George. And and as an example of the difficulty, I came back from Alaska. I had been out with scientists with helicopters capturing bears, where you dart a bear,
Yeah.
they're down immobilized with a muscle relaxant, Telazol, and they can't move. So you do your measurements, you collect data. I've been doing it for about 40 years in the southern Beaufort Sea, and I came back with all of this pictures and information. I got back to my little writing cabin that I work in, and I had no idea what I was going to write. And I also said, I think I have to go back to Alaska because I don't think I have everything I need. So then I sat there and I just put stuff down and I walked around and had coffee and just, I was in the Adirondacks and Tupper Lake, and I just had some beautiful walks. And then it sort of sifted, and this was for older, for older teens, kind of an older kids book, but it's still like, I just, that process of figuring out what you're going to do with what you've got is really can be a real stumper, and that's very difficult. Once you get going, then it becomes, as long as you you really concentrate, then you can do it.
It looks like we have exhausted our questions from the audience, so I'll ask you one more question, and that
Okay.
is maybe an obvious one. Are you itchy to get back in the canoe?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in the canoe a little bit. Melissa said on the first trip, she said, aren't you going to train for this thing? Because I was a lot younger, and I said, nah, I'll just be paddling. I'll build up my muscles as I go. This time round, I think I got to do a little training. So when I get back, it's probably in April and May, I'll start training for a July 3rd launch from the battery. And yeah, I love being in a canoe. And I had torn rotator cuff. So I had to, get some PRP, the blood platelet thing, and it seems to be working. And I swim. So when I got in the canoe with a double bladed paddle and a single blade paddle, I can change off and on. I can go back and forth, which is fun. And so I am dying to get out there. I love being on water. And when I get out towards, I went down to Dykeman Street and met with people at both the Yonkers Paddling Club and the Inwood Paddling Club, and I went out with them. And it just being on the river again, even underneath the George Washington Bridge, it's just sheer heaven. It's heaven.
Well, I can't wait to hear about how this one goes, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is feeling the same way.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I will say, Peter, thank you so much, and I'll turn things back over to our friends at the ADKX.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, yes, thank you, both of you, Peter and Mitch, for great discussion. And thanks to everyone in the audience out there for joining us. We can't see them, but they're out there. There's quite a few of you. So thank you for coming. And we hope to see you next month. Next month, we'll have Gary and Justin Van Ripper. They're the authors of the infamous Adirondack Kids series. They just released a new book in that series. So we're going to be talking about that coming up in December. Our website, theadkx.org/events, is where you can register for that, find out more information. We may be closed for this season, but be sure to stay connected with us on social media, our website, and through programs just like this. So a recording of this program will be on our YouTube channel within 24 hours. So if you want to go back and watch or watch any of our past library programs, you're able to do so. So that's all I have for all of us Adirondack Experience. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Peter and Mitch, and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.